Thank you. Welcome again, everyone. Glad to have you here with us. My name is Jess Catterett, and I am our field director here for the organizations hosting this webinar this evening, two distinct environmental advocacy organizations that share a strategic partnership, PennFuture and Conservation Voters. I'll tell you a little bit about them in a second, but tonight we're joined by one of our own, PennFuture's Senior Director of Energy and Climate, Rob Altenberg, as well as Ohio River Valley Institute's Executive Director, Joanne Kilgour, both of whom are going to give us an overview of what producing energy from hydrogen means, what proposals are on the table for Pennsylvania, and what we as advocates need to be aware of. PennFuture is an organization helping to lead the way towards a clean energy transition with legal, policy, communications, and civic engagement expertise. And Conservation Voters of PA is the state's accountability voice for the environment, helping to hold legislators accountable to the votes they take and working to ensure that legislators prioritize the environment. And together, we're strategizing and to work together to protect the air we breathe, the water we drink, our land, our natural resources, and our climate. Before we dive into it, to set the stage, of course, as you know, the fact of the matter is we're facing a climate crisis, and we live here in the state of Pennsylvania, one of the leading fossil fuel producers of our nation. While fossil fuels have gotten us where we are today, the science is clear that the ways we power our society need to change in order to guarantee a habitable world for generations to come. Using hydrogen to produce clean energy poses an interesting solution for some hard to decarbonize industries, but the reality is that the most common way hydrogen is used to produce clean energy is really just another way to keep fracking natural gas and create more climate change causing pollution. And unfortunately, we know that massive polluting infrastructure, like the proposals on the table we're going to learn a little bit about tonight, most often disproportionately impact communities of color and low-income communities. We know this is a new topic for many of us, and we want everyone to be aware and ready for what's to come. And that's why we're excited to host today's program, and we're grateful to Joanne and Rob for joining us this evening and sharing their expertise and knowledge. Like I said, after Joanne and Rob give their presentations, we're going to have some time for question and answer before we wrap up at 7 o'clock. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Joanne. She is both an environmental lawyer as well as a nonprofit professional with experience at Sierra Club's Pennsylvania chapter, Center for Coalfield Justice, and now she serves as the executive director of Ohio River Valley Institute. She's dedicated to securing social, economic, and environmental policies that support communities while demanding long-term structural change. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Joanne.
Thank you so much, Jess, and thanks everyone for having me. I'm going to start to share my screen here. So can everyone see this? Great. So today we're here to talk about what is the hype around hydrogen and relatedly carbon capture, use, and sequestration. So first I want to start out by just kind of grounding us in why all of a sudden are we hearing so much about hydrogen and hydrogen hubs. And a big part of the reason is that the Biden administration has set out a sort of all of the above, let's try to do everything we can to decarbonize our economy and our energy infrastructure as quickly as possible, and has invested in the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act to help us get there. So one of the programs that was included in the bipartisan infrastructure law was a clean hydrogen hubs competition where $8 billion was set aside for the creation of a clean hydrogen infrastructure across the United States. And the Department of Energy is defining clean hydrogen hubs as a network of clean hydrogen production potential and clean hydrogen hydrogen consumers with connective infrastructure all located in close proximity. So if you ask me, that's about as clear as mud. And so we've been trying to figure out since June of last year, really what all this means and how this is going to play out for communities like ours across the country. So a little more detail about the Department of Energy's Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub program. So again, I mentioned there's a total of $8 billion that was set aside in the statute, and $7 billion has been allocated to support the development of 6 to 10 hubs across the United States, where at least 2 of those hubs are going to be located in gas-producing regions, and at least 1 to be powered by fossil fuels. And the reason blue hydrogen is located there is that blue hydrogen is the term that is used for hydrogen produced from natural gas with carbon capture application to reduce some of the carbon emissions. So it's very likely that at least 1 of the hubs is going to be clean hydrogen generated from natural gas. And then the remaining 1 to 2 billion is reserved for potential future launches or supporting activities. And like many of the federal programs that have been launched, there is a cost sharing component. So the project applicants and the eventual hubs that will be funded will have to provide private or other public funding to support the total creation of the hub. And there's about an 8 to 12 year time horizon for this. So as we go through this and think about the decisions that we're making, we have to think about what position are we going to be in, not just tomorrow, but 8, 10, 12 years from now when these projects are up and running at scale. And there is a minimum production standard that the Department of Energy has put out. So that's just a minimum of 50 to 100 metric tons per day of hydrogen production, because they're really looking at this to scale up this infrastructure. This, again, is part of the Department of Energy's national hydrogen strategy. And just to put some context into these numbers, currently only about 10 million metric tons of hydrogen are produced in the United States, and 95% of that is what we call gray hydrogen, or hydrogen that's produced from fossil fuels without any emission or carbon capture technology applied to it. And so again, going back to this Department of Energy process and why there's so much energy, particularly right now, being devoted to the conversation around hydrogen, this is the timeline for the hydrogen hub selection process. So you can see we're actually pretty far down in the process, and full applications were submitted the first week in April. So since then, the Department of Energy and partners have been reviewing applications, and the deadline for replies to these comments is actually the end of this month. So DOE is going to be engaging in its interview process and its selection process throughout the summer, and they're expected to let the eventual hubs that are selected know that they have made it through the process by fall of this year. So this is a really accelerated timeline that we're going to start to see between now and the end of this calendar year. So all of that is about the kind of structure of the federal program. Why are we talking about this? But so far, we still haven't really talked about what a hydrogen hub is. And in some ways, the hub terminology is a little bit confusing, because what we're really talking about is a significant build out of new infrastructure, much of which would be similar to the fossil fuel infrastructure development that we've seen since the fracking boom. So this is just a sample, very oversimplified schematic of what a potential hydrogen hub might look like, or what some components might be. And we see in the top corner here, there's blue hydrogen production, which uses natural gas to create hydrogen and applies carbon capture technology to remove some of the carbon emissions that would be produced through that process. So on the right-hand side, you might be asking, well, if the hydrogen production is happening over here in the left side of the screen, why do we have gas-fired power plants, coal-fired power plants, factories, and underground carbon sequestration as part of this? And that's one of the complicated things for the discussion about hydrogen hubs, is that for most of the proposals that we're seeing coming out of our region, much of the infrastructure is actually related to carbon capture and carbon sequestration. So part of the development of this infrastructure includes that connective kind of pipeline of interrelated facilities. So this would include carbon capture at power plants, potentially, carbon capture at factories. It could also include an end use for hydrogen at these facilities, which Rob will talk more about during his presentation. But this is just to say that as we're talking about these hubs, we're actually talking about quite a lot more than just hydrogen. And in a blue hydrogen scenario where we're producing hydrogen from natural gas, there's a tremendous economic burden on the proposal to begin with. So first of all, we should mention that, again, none of this is currently happening at scale. And in fact, where there may be viable applications for hydrogen, it's very likely that as we get out into that 8, 10, 12-year time horizon, blue hydrogen with carbon capture is already going to be less economically viable than green hydrogen. So there are tremendous economic burdens for carbon capture also in the power sector. And there's also a pretty limited end use application for hydrogen, because we have a lot of better options for decarbonization for many of the proposed end uses than we get with hydrogen. And again, Rob's going to talk more about those potential end uses and carbon capture during his presentation. So what are some of the proposals that we've seen in the region so far? And just a quick note about these, most of the proposals that have been put forth to the Department of Energy are operating under either non-disclosure agreements or exemptions to public information requests. So all that we know about the current hub proposals is what the applicants themselves have made publicly available. So one proposal that's coming out of Pennsylvania is the Decarbonization Network of Appalachia, and this is being led by the Team Pennsylvania Foundation, and other key partners are the state of Pennsylvania and Shell Polymers. So potential end uses include industrial applications, power plants across the state, and they've provided their own kind of schematic, which is somewhat similar to our infographic, but just with a little more detail. You can see the Shell icon there in their schematic. But so this is the primary proposal coming out of Pennsylvania. And again, just connecting this back to climate and what's at stake here. We have Toby Rice here, who's the president and CEO of EQT, who in the release for one of these hydrogen hub proposals stated that he is engaged to demonstrate how natural gas can play a leading role in the transition to lower carbon energy solutions. So this is really about maintaining the position of natural gas within a decarbonized economy. The Team Pennsylvania has also put out a carbon capture roadmap to accompany the DNA hub proposal. And I raise this here just so you can see the extent of the infrastructure that's being proposed. So if this hub proposal were built out at the scale that they're envisioning, we would see an additional 1,400 miles of CO2 pipelines and other pipelines to transport the CO2 that's captured from all of these different sources. And in their vision, 89% of the emissions that are captured would actually be coming from power plants. So hydrogen would account for less than 15% of this proposal. So again, when we're talking about these hydrogen hubs, it's really much more expansive than that. And it's important to remember that in some cases, the hydrogen piece is actually quite a small piece of what's being proposed. And again, there are many documented concerns with CO2 pipelines. And so if the DNA proposal were to move forward and we would see 1,400 additional miles of pipeline, that's compared to about 5,000 total miles that currently exist, and that we have experience with, regulating and permitting and all of that. So that would be really a quite significant build out. Another proposal in the region, and this one has gotten quite a lot of traction and has many more partners engaged, is the Appalachian Regional Clean Hydrogen Hub, or the ARCH2 proposal. So they're proposing end uses including power generation, industrial, commercial, residential, and transportation. And they have quite an extensive project footprint. So I'll go to the next slide here, and you can see in the maps that they're proposing that these counties would be impacted by between 1 and 3 projects if their hub proposal is built at scale. So that's, again, a really significant impact across the region, including many parts of Pennsylvania, even beyond southwestern Pennsylvania, which is contiguous to the other states. And there are some projects that they have already announced, including a blue ammonia facility, a waste to fuel project, and a couple of electrolysis projects. So when we hear these kinds of projects, they don't immediately sound like top tier or high priority decarbonization investments, but these are some of the anchor projects that have been announced so far. 2 additional and that includes parts of Pennsylvania and Indiana, but is primarily Ohio and Michigan. And this would be hydrogen derived from nuclear power, or pink hydrogen. And they have some prime applicants in the industrial sector, and as well as steel and aerospace. And then another proposal that you all might be familiar with is the Mid-Atlantic Clean Hydrogen Hub, or the MACH2 proposal, which covers more the eastern part of the state, so Philadelphia, New Jersey, Delaware, and they're proposing end uses in heavy industry and transportation, and would see a kind of a staged hydrogen development, beginning with blue hydrogen and transitioning to green or pink. And again, green is hydrogen produced from fossil-free sources, and pink is hydrogen produced from nuclear. So it's unclear exactly how that transition might happen, but that's at least how the project is being discussed publicly. So when we think about an overview of not just the regional proposals that we've reviewed, but at a national level, how is this shaping up? The primary takeaway is that the initial information suggests that most of this regional clean hydrogen hub funding would go toward extraction, transportation, and use of fossil fuels, primarily natural gas. So we're predicting that investments in the clean hydrogen hub infrastructure are also essentially investments in perpetuating the oil and gas industry throughout the country, and particularly in our region. And one thing to mention, in some of our research, it's easy to talk about this stuff just from a climate standpoint or just from an economic standpoint, but it's really helpful, I think, to remember that there's a human cost to this as well, a direct human cost. And I was pretty shocked when we saw these statistics. So we've been doing some analysis of the counties that produce the most oil and gas within the region. And nationally, just about 7.5% of US counties have a cancer risk of greater than 1 in 1 million, but 100% of the counties that are major gas producing counties in our region see that same level of risk. And in fact, in Ohio, only those counties see that level of risk. So there's a pretty clear line between the climate, but also the human health costs when we continue to make these investments. And in addition to the kind of health related costs, there's also been a tension between the hydrogen hub and carbon capture proposals and the articulated Justice 40 goals. So in addition to all of the decarbonization work and the bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act work that the Biden administration has been doing, they've set out a goal for 40% of the benefit from these programs to land in communities that have traditionally been environmental justice communities or have borne the burden of a lot of our previous polluting industry. And one of the things that the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council has stated directly will not benefit a community is carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture utilization and storage. So here we have the primary entity that's tasked with advising the country on environmental justice issues, saying in no uncertain terms, we do not believe that this is a benefit to our communities. And yet over here, we're proposing really significant investments of public funds in just those strategies. So I think that's a tension that's going to be a live debate over the course of the selection process for the hubs, and will certainly come into play as applicants are trying to make the case for their 40% benefit. Similarly, we've seen applicants, so the DNA Hydrogen Hub project summary, so this is the Pennsylvania and Team Pennsylvania Foundation proposal, has articulated environmental justice in terms of GDP. So they're essentially saying that communities stand to see billions of dollars in GDP growth as a result of the potential siting of these projects in their communities. And yet there's a lot of research that demonstrates that GDP is actually not a measure of justice or well-being, and that GDP is usually just a measure of what's taken out of a community. So I think we have to be looking at how the proposals are framing community benefits and environmental justice, and kind of bringing an eye toward what are environmental justice communities saying, and what does the research tell us about what are actually good indicators of well-being. So that is the kind of initial overview that I prepared for the Department of Energy program, where things currently stand with different proposals, and some considerations around climate, health, and environmental justice. So now I'm very happy to pass things back to Jess, and we'll all stay on at the end, and Rob and I can answer questions after his presentation. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Joanne. Really appreciate you being here with us and sharing all of that great information and raising the key issue that these projects can raise for environmental justice communities, especially. We are now going to head to our next panelist and speaker, one of our own, Rob Altenberg. Before I introduce Rob, please don't forget, folks, about the question and answer section and portion of Zoom at the bottom of your screen, the 2 speech bubbles. Drop your questions there. Thanks to those that already submitted some, and some before the event too. And now we'll head into Rob's portion. Rob has spent over 20 years with the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, where he focused on air emissions and air quality, and then served as an executive policy specialist. He's a lawyer, he's a veteran, and now serves as PennFuture's Senior Director for Energy and Climate. And Rob, I will turn it over to you.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Jess. And thanks, Joanne, all the folks that work behind the scenes to getting this set up. And thank you to everybody who's attending this. We're all hearing a sales pitch for hydrogen. It's what it can do, what it might do. And we all know that when it comes to sales pitches, it's buyer beware. So in the next 15 minutes or so, what I'm going to try to focus on is some questions that we should all keep in mind when we hear about these projects. First, if we're going to make a lot of hydrogen, if we're going to have these hubs and if they're going to be successful, whether it's clean or dirty hydrogen, the big question is, what are we going to do with it? The global demand for hydrogen, it's been trending up since about 1975 or so, and it's mainly been happening in the sectors of petrochemical processing and ammonia production. And when it comes to other applications, there's just been more talk than action, and we'll discuss here tonight some of the reasons why that's been happening. It does have a lot of challenges, and before we go into detail on that, I did want to flag this climate sustainability issue. One of the things that we ground our work on is whether or not this is going to lead to a sustainable economy and a sustainable future for Pennsylvania. When you look at, when you frame hydrogen in that lens, particularly when you're talking about what the uses are for hydrogen, we have to look at that big top sector of hydrogen today. 57% of today's hydrogen goes into petroleum refining. If we are going to achieve our climate goals, that number is going to have to come down dramatically. So when we talk about need for hydrogen markets to make the hydrogen hub work, it isn't just starting where we are today and then building going forward. We have to make up ground from scaling down this petroleum use. So it is a pretty high hurdle. Now, I listed here a few of the basic challenges that we see meeting. Cost and production costs are probably one of the most significant reasons we're not seeing more hydrogen than we are. Right now, 1 million BTUs worth of hydrogen costs about 3 times as much as 1 million BTUs worth of fracked gas. And clean hydrogen, it varies, but clean hydrogen can be more expensive today. It's harder to store, it's harder to transport. But as we'll see, there aren't a whole lot of really compelling applications. And Jerome mentioned this, where there's alternatives. There's a lot of alternatives, and those alternatives, if they're not clearly better, they're often good enough. And as we'll see, that's going to make it very difficult for hydrogen to break into a lot of these markets. So for many things, electrification is a better alternative. It's cleaner now, and it's only going to get even cleaner as we clean up our grid. So we can not only use solar and wind energy that's clean today, we can use that energy to power electric heat pumps and capture thermal energy, which is a whole different type of renewable energy that's out there. So we have a lot of these good options, but there are things that either can't be plugged in very easily, or for one reason or another, electrification is challenging. And we see this list in a lot of different places. The big ones, the steel industry, the cement industry, and long distance transportation. Again and again, these are identified as the prime candidates where hydrogen may have a role. But even though a lot of different people have identified potential there, these are still very much in the maybe category. It's not necessarily that hydrogen is the only alternative for these categories. It could work, but we really haven't seen a lot of this these things actually operate in practice. Also, it's important to remember that these categories, they're important. And if we're talking about a future where we're going to get to net zero, we're going to have to address emissions from these categories. But there's still a relatively small piece of the overall climate change puzzle. So even if we did all of these and completely decarbonize our steel, cement, long distance transportation issues with hydrogen, there's a whole lot of other areas we need to be working on now. And hydrogen really isn't a particularly good choice for that. And a lot of the other applications that we hear and sometimes referenced as, well, we can do X, Y, Z with this hydrogen that we make, they just aren't that compelling. Power generation, we've heard testimony in our legislature and other places where people suggest, well, we can make hydrogen and then burn hydrogen in power plants. And that really doesn't make any sense at all. We have to think of hydrogen as more like a battery than a fuel. It may have storage applications, but using energy to make hydrogen and then burning that hydrogen to make energy is just wasteful. We're likely far better off just using the energy we had to start with rather than have this intermediate step of hydrogen creation. Transportation, well, we identified long distance transportation as an area where hydrogen may have some applications, rail, shipping, those sorts of things, possibly. Light and medium duty highway vehicles, probably not a huge area for hydrogen to get any traction. Now, we have hydrogen fuel cell vehicles today. The technology exists, it works pretty well. But fielding that on a national scale to consumer commercial vehicles, that takes an awful lot. And there's a chicken and an egg problem associated with that. Nobody's going to buy a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle until literally billions of dollars have been invested in the hydrogen fueling network to make the fuel available. And nobody is sensibly going to put billions of dollars into that fueling network unless they're really sure that people are going to buy these vehicles. Now, we went through a very similar model with natural gas powered vehicles about 15, 20 years ago, where there was a big push to convert. And it made some traction in things like centrally fueled fleets or maybe airport service equipment or things like that, where there was a fleet in a very concentrated area and could always fuel in the same place. But in terms of consumer vehicles, never made much sense. There was never, there are natural gas fueling stations around, but there just aren't enough of them, and they're relatively expensive. And this is one of those situations where there are issues with electric vehicles. Range anxiety continues to be an issue, but for the vast majority of trips, 90-some% of the trips, and typically, the range of an electric vehicle is more than good enough. Hydrogen, you can, maybe fill a hydrogen tank faster than you can recharge an electric vehicle, but is that a compelling enough issue to have people choose to buy, really what is now speculative, be speculative early adopters of hydrogen vehicles over electric? We're not seeing that, and we don't expect to see that. So highway vehicles just aren't likely to be, a big frontier for hydrogen. Heating and cooling is another one. We've heard talk about either piping the hydrogen in what are today's gas lines or blending hydrogen with gas lines. And again, a lot of these things don't make sense. Hydrogen itself, very small molecule, it leaks very easily. We have a lot of work to do on our existing gas infrastructure to eliminate leaks. If it went to hydrogen, that problem would get much, much more significant. Plus, if somebody's going to be investing in new equipment, we already have heat pumps, we already have other options, and there's more and more options coming as we go along. So electrification, heat pumps, and other options can really address these issues. Certainly with your own, solar, you can have your own solar. If we adopt community solar, it makes it even cheaper. So there's really good heating options that don't require hydrogen. Aviation, well, that's another one where people say, you could, solve this problem of the emissions from these jet aircraft by going to hydrogen. And there are test beds being built and there are studies being done on this, and we might actually see this. But certifying a new airframe is a very, very long and expensive process. So getting an experimental test vehicle up that flies and says, yes, we can fly this aircraft on hydrogen, that's pretty straightforward. Getting through the regulatory requirements to bring a new model of airliner into service is a very challenging, very difficult, and very, very expensive thing. It may happen, there may be some opportunity for that, but this is just one of the routes going forward. So we certainly can't guarantee that that's going to be the future of hydrogen. Switching a bit now to carbon capture and storage, carbon capture utilization and storage. A lot of these hubs, as Joe mentioned, rely on this concept of carbon capture. And the way that it tends to be presented is, well, we're going to do this. Sure, it's going to use these polluting fossil fuels, but sometime in the future, we're going to put carbon capture on it, and that's going to fix the problem. That's what we hear. And now the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has, at least from the fifth assessment report back in 2014, really highlighted we need carbon capture if we are going to get to net zero. There's some things that carbon capture would be important for. But that's a very different statement than saying, well, we're going to do something that we don't need to do and try to justify it with carbon capture. Our electric power industry, what IPC said just really just last year in their sixth assessment report is, yeah, we have a need for carbon capture in our electric generation industry, but we're not there, and we're not close to getting there. It just hasn't been adopted anywhere near the rate, and there's a whole lot of reasons for that. Some of which Sharon touched on, but we can go into a little bit more detail on that. But just to frame the thinking about it, I'll just walk through the most typical carbon capture process today. It's this amine-based process, and we won't go into detail on the chemistry of it, but just to give you an idea of how complicated a process this really is. I mean, you have to capture the flue gas, the gas with a carbon in it. And from a power plant, that might be pretty straightforward. You can do that. But if you're talking about a mobile source or an area source or fugitive gases or things like that, that becomes a problem. So you need to have it in the same place. If you're talking about a power plant particularly, you've got to run the gas through some sort of cooling process. And that takes energy, whether it's running pumps or running fans or running other equipment. You're putting energy into the system doing that. From there, the gas runs into this absorber tower, which is these amines, these chemicals, and these chemicals draw the carbon out of the flue gas. Works very well. And when you hear somebody say carbon capture can get to 90% efficiency, what they're talking about is this process of this chemical reaction of pulling the carbon out, this little piece of the puzzle can get up to 90%, maybe even more than 90% efficiency. This piece can. But efficiency, well, we can talk about that in some different ways, and we'll think about that. So we get the hydrogen out of the flue gas, and it's sitting in this chemical. So now we've got to get the hydrogen out of the carbon out of the chemical. So to do that, we have to heat it up. And these are called desorbers or regenerators or strippers or some other, goes by some other name, but you essentially cook it to bring the carbon off. And then, so you get the CO, that takes energy, that takes even more energy. Once the CO2 is off, well, what are you going to do with it? To transport it, they tend to compress it, either compress it or even liquefy it. And that's a whole nother process that's an energy intensive process. Then we have to transport it, whether it's by pipeline or truck. Other issues, other expenses with the transport. And then, once we got to that point, now we get to the geology questions of where do we put it? And there's a whole lot of issues around that. So every step of this process really adds energy, adds cost, adds time. So we don't know what the carbon capture of technology of the future is going to be. We know it's never going to be cheap. It's never going to be cheaper than the things people are doing today. So when we hear, well, we're not going to do carbon capture today because it's too expensive, but we'll be carbon capture ready and we'll think about doing carbon capture later, I would be very skeptical. We're never going to do carbon capture if people are going to wait until it gets cheaper, because it just isn't. So limitations of carbon capture, we talked about this: high cost, energy requirements, very challenging to do. It's limited scalability. You build it in one place, you design it for one plant, that's it. You have to essentially reinvent the wheel often every time you build it or adapt it to another plant. It's very challenging to design this process, and challenging is expensive. We also didn't mention the leakage concerns. All of those steps has these opportunities for fugitive leakage. So yeah, we said, yeah, chemically, the chemical reaction, you can get that to 90% efficiency or more. But if you measure efficiency of how much energy you're putting into the process and how much leakage you're trying to stop from the process, these plants rarely get, at least now in the Team PA report, their best options. We're talking about efficiency rates in the 60% range. So it's not a particularly effective way. And 90% is seen now as the holy grail target. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report is pretty clear that 90% isn't good enough. They've got to be getting up to 98% or more to really get where we need to go. So, very limited applications, very limited use. And this last point I'm going to make is probably the most important. This is diverting time and resources and energy from things we know how to do and things that work today. And we have a minuscule amount of solar and clean renewable generation fielded in Pennsylvania. Yeah, we might need carbon capture and we might need hydrogen to get to those last few percent of net zero. But we can get a whole lot further, a whole lot cheaper with things that we know how to do today. And diverting all these resources into speculative future things is making it more challenging to do what we really need to be doing. And the result of this, as I think John alluded to, is the whole system ends up prolonging our dependence on fossil fuels and is making it much, much harder to reach our climate targets. So I will stop there and I hand it back to Jess.
Thank you so much, Rob and Joanne. Really appreciate you sharing. I know that this is a lot for folks to take in, and I appreciate you sharing your insight and your expertise with us. We're going to head into the Q&A portion, and we're going to take it back to basics for a quick second. We might be restating some things that we explained in the presentation before, but for folks that are still working this through, and maybe folks that joined us late, welcome. Joanne or Rob, can either of you state in several sentences, how do they make hydrogen and what will it be used for? Couple sentences, right? I know we've got colored up hydrogen. What is the basic on the table?
Well, Rob, I can start, and then if you want to fill in any gaps, but just at a super basic level, the proposals that we're seeing are for this region predominantly rely on hydrogen produced from natural gas or fracked gas that goes through a process, and as a normal part of that process, emissions are produced. So carbon emissions would still be produced to burn gas and create the hydrogen. And so the blue hydrogen comes from adding what Rob was describing as a carbon capture process onto that production process so that you're getting hydrogen produced from fracked gas, but with some fewer carbon emissions because of the application of carbon capture technology. And then, the end uses are varying depending on the proposal. So in a couple of the slides that I shared, there were a few concrete projects. So one proposal in the Team Pennsylvania, the Decarbonization Network of Appalachia proposal, is to use carbon capture at the Shell Monaca chemical facility that's in Beaver County. And again, that's not necessarily directly related to the hydrogen component of the hydrogen hub, but that's one of the uses that they're proposing as part of their application. And then we see in the ARCH2 proposal, or the Appalachian Clean Hydrogen Hub proposal, that one of the first facilities that was announced that would use the hydrogen is an ammonia production facility. And so that ammonia could be used in things like fertilizer or other applications, but that's one example of the kinds of proposals that have been announced to date.
Thanks, Joanne. Anything to add, Rob?
No, that's great.
Yeah, appreciate you. I know there's a lot of proposals on the table. There's a lot of different ways it can be produced. So I appreciate you trying to boil it down. And we do have a question, so I just want to clarify, because I think this is a big part of confusion for folks. So a couple people asked, what part of green hydrogen is this project, which I know we touched on a little bit, and green hydrogen is what's produced by renewable energy. How much is this realistically part of the hubs? And so I was hoping, Joanne, you could just rephrase really quickly how it realistically plays a part here.
Sure. So the kind of short answer is that for our region, we are not seeing green hydrogen based hub proposals. Again, the Mach 2 proposal, which is the Eastern Pennsylvania proposal that includes Philadelphia, Delaware, and New Jersey, they've stated that they would like to start with blue hydrogen, so hydrogen produced from fracked gas, and then eventually transition to fossil-free hydrogen production. Although I will say that, we should ask questions about that, because investing in the blue hydrogen infrastructure is going to be a significant and costly investment, and making that transition to another form of hydrogen production, you wonder about things like there's a term stranded assets, or investments that become obsolete, and often once the investment is made, it's very hard to transition to another production mode. But so nationally, we're seeing that less than a quarter of the 22 confirmed pre-applicants plan to produce hydrogen solely using renewable energy and water. And a lot of those are West Coast or Hawaii-based proposals.
Thank you, Joanne. One last question for you specifically, and certainly Rob, if you want to weigh in, but a lot of folks are wondering, so you gave a good basic overview of the multiple proposals on the table here. Folks are wondering, how are we supposed to find out about them, and how can folks track new ones or find out more information about existing proposals?
Well, I wish I had a better answer for you on this one, because this has been one of the real challenges in terms of public transparency around this process from the beginning, because these tend to be highly sensitive, technical, corporate proposals where you might have multiple companies and universities and local governments working together to put together a very technical proposal. And given the competitive nature of the program, most applicants have not released their full proposals for public consumption. And the Department of Energy's position is that they won't release them to the public, and that it's up to the applicants themselves to decide whether they want the public to have that information. And the same is true for the concept papers, which were the shorter, initial phase proposal. So I know, for example, that Arch to get a copy of the full proposal, they ask that you sign on to their MOU and become a partner, and then also sign a non-disclosure agreement. So it's challenging to get information other than what's been publicly released. And I will say that for the Team Pennsylvania DNA proposal, they actually have added quite a lot more to their site. So they've included that diagram that I had in one of my slides, and they have some additional project information that they've released. It's not their full application, but it is a publicly available website where you can go to get more information.
Thanks, Joanne. So a lot of questions are pointing to this issue of, lack of transparency. Who is in charge? Who are the decision makers that are ultimately going to either need to be brought up to speed because of everything we've touched the surface on today? And how are our organizations working to ensure that legislators and decision makers are educated? Rob, I'll hand it to you first, maybe, and then Joanne, certainly anything you have to add.
Yeah, so regarding the hydrogen hubs in general, the Department of Energy has certain standards that they have put in place, in the rules for qualifying. yeah, there are a whole lot of issues around that. One of the questions in the chat says relates to who is the regulator in charge of regulating the pipelines. You know, who is, where are those? Where are we going to? If there's carbon capture, there's going to be a whole separate question of who has primacy for the injection wells. Is it a state responsibility? Is it a federal responsibility? A lot of these questions simply haven't been answered. I don't know. I'll say if Joanne has a better answer to it. I mean, we can assume there is going to be a mix of state and federal regulation, but I think it's very hard to say in any detail now who's going to be responsible.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, one of the things that we've seen is that, this is framed as a competitive funding process. But in order to facilitate the development that's envisioned, we really do need to see a lot of significant updating to our state and local laws and regulations. And that's something I think we're likely to see in Pennsylvania this legislative session is various proposals that are likely to come out pertaining to hydrogen production and especially pertaining to the management of carbon.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, I would say as field director for some of these organizations, I would say please keep in touch with our teams. We will continue to keep folks updated. And also we are working with our digital teams in the coming weeks to ensure that we've got some really easy to understand infographics and things for folks to grasp and keep folks updated as much as we are. But we know it's hard to track and we're doing our best to stay on top here. Joanne, you had mentioned the direct tension that these proposals raise with the environmental justice goals of this administration. And knowing, unfortunately, that we don't have a lot of avenues right now to know where to make change or which proposals are moving forward, how can we work to ensure that environmental justice is truly prioritized and that disenfranchised communities aren't further harmed in the selection of these projects as best we can?
So this is probably going to be an unsatisfactory response, but one of the pathways or potential pathways is through the community benefits agreement process. So most of these proposals are going to have to engage in and come up with a community benefits plan. And ideally, the Department of Energy will look very critically at the community benefits agreements and the process through which those were developed. And, it might be the case that that's an avenue for environmental justice communities and organizations that have been working on these issues for a long time to intervene and provide their perspective. I'll also say I referenced the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. They have been doing a phenomenal job advocating toward the Biden administration. I think, Pennsylvania has an Environmental Justice Advisory Board and an Office of Environmental Justice. The new acting secretary of DEP has set out environmental justice as one of their top 4 pillars. And so I think there's a, potential for groups to raise this with the Office of Environmental Justice, raise this with the Environmental Justice Advisory Board members, and at least try to begin a dialogue around how to make sure that communities are directly involved in framing what constitutes a benefit to them, rather than having that predetermined on their behalf.
Thank you, Joanne. So we only have a couple of minutes left here. I've got two questions, and folks, we know you have so many questions about this. We're so grateful for you for being here tonight, for being engaged on this next phase of environmental protection with us. And so the question I have, and Rob, I'll start with you. Certainly, Joanne, I want to hear your thoughts as well. Folks are wondering, you said a lot, Rob, about how if we're investing, why would we invest in this when we could be investing in so many different things? And could you restate or review, what are some of the industries or clean energy avenues that we would rather see than investing in blue hydrogen or otherwise here in this state?
Yeah, I think in general, this is one of those, a lot of environmental protection and a lot of reduction of pollution. There's an 80-20 rule. The first 80% is a whole lot easier than the last 20%. Hydrogen, carbon capture, these are last 20% issues, certainly. The things that we can do now, energy efficiency is already cost effective. We have the Act 129 plant in Pennsylvania where we are investing in energy efficiency at no net cost to the consumer. It saves us money today. Putting solar is highly cost effective. Enabling community solar, increasing their APS standards, getting more solar, getting more clean renewable generation. That's cost effective. That brings a lot of jobs and a lot of economic benefit to Pennsylvania today. Those are things we absolutely need. They're cheap. We know how to do them. That's where we need to be putting the 80% of our effort. This stuff, yeah, we need to do the research. We need to keep talking about it. We need to keep thinking about it because eventually for that last bit to get to net zero, we might need some of these tools. But that's not where we need to be spending the bulk of our time today.
Thanks, Rob. Joanne, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
The only other thing I'll add is that these bills, so both the bipartisan infrastructure law and especially the Inflation Reduction Act, have a lot of great programs, and actually some of them are of a greater size than the hydrogen hub funding. So for example, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is significantly greater than the Clean Hydrogen Hub competitive grant program. There are climate pollution reduction grants, and Pennsylvania is definitely engaged in both of those processes. But what we haven't seen is the same kind of cross-sector collaboration developing to really aggressively go after those funds and make sure that we can pull them down for Pennsylvania. And I think that there's a big opportunity there for local elected officials, for state level elected officials and policymakers, for companies that stand to benefit and community members to really come together and put the same amount of investment in organizing infrastructure to try to take advantage of the programs that can do what Rob said, like really get us to a point where we're taking advantage of the 80% strategies.
Thanks, Joanne. So last question for you both, and then we're going to wrap up here. I and many folks are wondering, what is the next step? What can we do? And I hear you that there's still some lack of insight into how these proposals are going to play out. But I'm curious to hear from both of you in the time being, what is the best way for attendees to call and leverage to stop this project, to slow it or fight for the best path forward? Joanne, you're off mute, so I'll start with you.
So, I would say this is a great first step, like getting a sense of what are we talking about when we're talking about hydrogen and carbon capture infrastructure, and how can we educate ourselves so that we can be informed in conversations with our neighbors and local decision makers about different investments. And I think, it can feel like the writing's sort of on the wall because there's this legislation, it's moving forward through Department of Energy, but there are a lot of remaining pieces yet to be negotiated. And, things like state level regulations and state level legislation about if this infrastructure were to come here, how much public protection is going to accompany it. And then, similarly, at the end of last legislative session, there was a tax credit passed that included an additional benefit for hydrogen produced from natural gas. So it's not just that we're seeing federal money, we're also seeing state level incentives. And I think because of how some of the financials are working out on this, it's likely that there's going to be additional pressure to see more state and local public subsidies go into the program, which I think is something we can all, keep an eye out for and decide, is this how we want to invest our taxpayer money? So that's one thing. And, to learn more, there will be a House Environmental Resources and Energy Committee hearing on May 22nd. So that will be through the Pennsylvania House of Representatives committee. And so I think there's going to be a lot of ongoing opportunity to engage and to kind of shine a light on what all the real issues are at play here.
And I will add that it's, if people feel overwhelmed by the speed and the volume of stuff that comes out on this, I mean, that is very understandable. The one bill that Joanne mentioned, we were getting calls from legislators because they hadn't even seen the language until really right before the vote, and they were saying, "What is in this? What does this mean?" Asking these questions. You know, certainly the resources here, ORV, PennFuture, Conservation Voters of PA. There's people that are, you know, going to be spending the time trying to track this and keep on top of this. And sometimes it's a challenge for organizations like ours, but certainly, you know, following, you know, whether it's the social media channels or subscribing to the newsletters and things like that is probably the best way to keep in touch with them.
Thank you, Rob. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. You'll get sent a copy of this recording next week, but I do have to extend our gratitude to Joanne and Rob for sharing their expertise with us this evening as we all educate ourselves on this next phase of environmental advocacy work. Of course, as Joanne and Rob noted, we know we need to move to newer technology to power our society, but we need to do so thoughtfully and in line with what the science tells us, not necessarily industry. So as Rob said, keep an eye on your inbox for more ways to continue advocating for environmental protections from PennFuture, Conservation Voters, Ohio River Valley Institute. And please also don't forget that every election matters, and there's 2 of them a year, and one of them is next Tuesday, May 16th. So get out to the polls between 7 a.m. and 8 p.m. and make sure you're voting for local leaders that prioritize your environment. Thank you so much again for joining this evening. Talk to you all soon. Bye.